December 18th, 1944. The frozen fields of eastern France lay silent under a blanket of fresh snow, broken only by the skeletal remains of an abandoned farmhouse. In the attic window, a figure stood motionless, silhouetted against the pale winter light. 300 meters away, German soldiers huddled in their defensive position, watching that window with growing frustration. They had no idea they were staring at a collection of old clothes stuffed with straw, carefully positioned by a 22-year-old farm girl who had turned her childhood skills into a deadly game of patience. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those German soldiers were about to learn was that sometimes the most dangerous opponent in conflict isn't the one with the most training or the best equipment, but the one who understands the land, the light, and most importantly, how to make you see exactly what you expect to see. Marie Ducroix had never intended to become part of the conflict. She had grown up on her family's farm in the Alsace region, learning to plant, harvest, and protect crops from both weather and wildlife. Her father, Jean Ducroix, had taught her to build scarecrows when she was just 7 years old. Not the simple stick figures that most farmers used, but elaborate decoys that could fool even the cleverest crows. He would position them at different angles throughout the day, move them slightly each morning, even change their clothing to match the seasons. The crows, he explained, were watching, always watching. And the moment they realized something wasn't real, they would descend on the crops without fear. By the time Marie was 15, she could create a scarecrow so lifelike that her own mother had once called out to it from across the field, thinking it was a neighbor. She understood how fabric moved in wind, how shadows fell at different times of day, how to position an object so it caught the eye naturally. These were skills meant for protecting wheat and barley, not for surviving a conflict that had turned her homeland into a battlefield. The American forces had pushed through the region in late November, and Marie's family farm sat in an uncomfortable position between the advancing Allied lines and the German defensive positions that refused to yield. Her parents had evacuated to her aunt's home 30 kilometers south, but Marie had stayed behind. Someone needed to protect what remained of their property, she had argued. The real reason, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, was that she couldn't bear to abandon the land where she had grown up. The first German soldiers arrived on December 15th. There were 8 of them, part of a small reconnaissance unit that had been separated from their main force during the American advance. Their leader, Feldwebel Klaus Hoffmann, was a 34-year-old veteran who had seen action across multiple fronts. He carried himself with the weary competence of someone who had survived far longer than statistics suggested he should. With him was Obergefreiter Ernst Weber, a talented marksman from Bavaria who had been assigned to their unit 6 months earlier. Weber had earned a reputation for patience. Unlike many sharpshooters who took quick shots at fleeting opportunities, Weber would wait for hours, sometimes entire days, for the perfect moment. He understood that in modern conflict, the sniper's greatest weapon wasn't the rifle, but the psychological pressure of knowing someone was watching, waiting. One well-placed observer could paralyze enemy movement across an entire sector. When Hoffmann's unit occupied the stone barn 400 meters from the Ducroix farmhouse, Weber immediately identified the attic window as a critical position. It offered clear sightlines across the approach routes the American forces would likely use. More importantly, it was exactly where he would position himself if their situations were reversed. Marie watched from the farmhouse cellar as the German soldiers established their position. She had been hiding there for 3 days, surviving on preserved vegetables and collected rainwater. The cellar had a small horizontal window at ground level, barely 30 centimeters tall, that looked out across the fields. Through this narrow view, she observed the soldiers' routines, their patrol patterns, the way they moved between the barn and the small outbuildings they had converted into defensive positions. On the second day, she noticed Weber. He was different from the others. While his companions moved with the casual awareness of experienced soldiers, Weber moved like a predator. His eyes constantly scanned, evaluated, measured. She watched him study the farmhouse, saw his gaze linger on the attic window. She understood, with the clarity that comes from knowing your own land intimately, that he was planning to shoot anyone who appeared there. The idea came to her that evening as she sat in the cellar, remembering her father's lessons about the crows. The German soldiers expected to see an American soldier in that window eventually. They were watching for movement, for the glint of binoculars or a weapon, for any sign of enemy observation. What if she gave them exactly what they expected to see, but made it something that could never give them the satisfaction of confirmation? She waited until full darkness, then moved through the house with practiced silence. The attic was exactly as she had left it 3 months earlier, when she had last helped her father store the autumn hay. The wooden support beams, the old trunk containing her grandmother's clothes, the farming tools arranged along the wall, everything was familiar territory. She could navigate this space blindfolded. Working by moonlight, Marie assembled her creation. She started with her father's old work jacket, stuffed with straw from the remaining hay bales. The trousers came next, positioned so they would suggest someone kneeling at the window. For the head, she used a burlap sack wrapped in fabric, with her grandmother's old hat perched on top. The key, she remembered her father saying, was the silhouette. Get the outline right, and the observer's mind would fill in the details. But Marie went further. She understood that Weber wasn't a crow. He was a trained observer who would be looking for specific details. So she added them. She positioned one of her father's pipes in the figure's mouth, knowing it would create a distinctive profile. She draped an old scarf around the neck, arranging it so one end hung down naturally. Most importantly, she angled the figure so it appeared to be looking out across the fields, toward the German positions, with binoculars made from 2 tin cans wrapped in dark cloth, held up to where the eyes would be. The positioning was critical. She placed the Scarecrow 2 meters back from the window, knowing that the depth would make it harder to see clearly, while still creating a visible silhouette. She arranged it so the morning light would catch it at an angle, making it appear more solid and real. Then she did something that showed her true understanding of her opponent's psychology. She made it slightly imperfect. The hat was tilted at a casual angle. The binoculars were held in a relaxed grip, not the rigid posture of constant observation. It looked exactly like someone who had been watching for hours and was beginning to tire. When she finished, she stepped back and evaluated her work. In the dim light, even knowing it was artificial, the figure looked convincingly human. It had presence, weight, reality. The next morning, December 17th, Ernst Weber spotted the figure in the attic window at 06:43 hours. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the frozen fields. He was performing his routine observation sweep when movement, or what his trained eye interpreted as movement, caught his attention. There, in the farmhouse attic window, was an American soldier conducting surveillance. Weber felt a familiar surge of professional satisfaction. He had been right about that window. He settled into position, adjusting his rifle and calculating the shot. Range, approximately 320 meters. Wind minimal, from the northeast at perhaps 5 kilometers per hour. Light, improving but still challenging, with the sun behind and to the left of the target. But something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the absolute stillness of the figure, or the way it remained in the exact same position for minutes at a time. Weber was accustomed to patient opponents, but this was unusual. He decided to wait, to observe, to gather more information before committing to the shot. By 07:30 hours, the figure hadn't moved, not even slightly. Weber mentioned it to Hoffman during the morning briefing. An American observer in the farmhouse attic, he reported, maintaining position for extended surveillance. Hoffman trusted Weber's judgment completely and ordered increased vigilance. If the Americans had an observation post in that farmhouse, it meant they were planning something. Throughout that first day, Weber watched the figure obsessively. He mapped every detail through his scope. The pipe in the mouth, the tilted hat, the binoculars, the casual stance that suggested confidence, perhaps even arrogance. He waited for the perfect shot, but something kept stopping him. The figure never shifted position for comfort, never lowered the binoculars, never showed any of the small human movements that even the most disciplined soldiers couldn't completely suppress. By evening, Weber was frustrated, but also intrigued. He had encountered patient opponents before, but this was extraordinary. Either the American in that window had superhuman discipline, or something wasn't right. Marie, watching from the cellar, saw Weber's attention fixated on her creation. She allowed herself a small smile. The first part of her plan was working. She had his complete focus. Now came the delicate part. She had to maintain the illusion long enough to accomplish her actual objective. That night, she made subtle changes to the Scarecrow. She shifted its position by perhaps 10 centimeters, adjusted the angle of the hat slightly, moved one arm to suggest a different posture. These weren't the dramatic changes that would reveal the deception, but small variations that a real person might make between observation shifts. She was counting on the fact that Weber couldn't watch every single moment, that there would be hours of darkness and periods when he had to sleep or attend to other duties. The second day, December 18th, Weber noticed the changes immediately. The figure was in a slightly different position. The hat was adjusted. One of the binoculars was angled differently. He felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. So the American did move. He just did it during the hours when observation was impossible. This confirmed Weber's assessment. He was dealing with a professional, someone who understood the value of minimal exposure. Hoffman became increasingly concerned. If the Americans had an observer in that farmhouse, they likely had more forces nearby than their intelligence suggested. He ordered his unit to maintain defensive positions and avoid unnecessary exposure. The presence of that single figure in the window was beginning to influence their tactical decisions. Weber spent the entire second day attempting to catch the observer in a moment of carelessness. He watched through dawn, through midday, through dusk. The figure remained motionless for hours, then would somehow shift position during the brief periods when Weber had to look away or attend to basic necessities. It was maddening. Several times he came within a heartbeat of taking the shot, but something held him back. Perhaps it was professional pride. He wanted the perfect shot, not just an adequate one. Perhaps it was curiosity about this worthy opponent. Or perhaps, at some level, his conscious mind hadn't yet acknowledged he sensed something wasn't quite right. Marie used those 2 days to accomplish what she had actually intended from the beginning. While Weber's attention was locked on the attic window, she was systematically documenting the German positions. Through the cellar window, using her father's old surveying equipment, she mapped every defensive position, every patrol route, every weak point in their perimeter. She noted the times when guards changed, when attention was most relaxed, where their supplies were stored. She sketched detailed diagrams on the backs of old farming receipts, using terminology she had learned from listening to Allied radio broadcasts. More importantly, she identified something the German soldiers themselves might not have fully appreciated. Their defensive position, while strong against a frontal assault, was vulnerable from the northeast, where a small ravine provided covered approach. American forces could use that ravine to get within 50 meters of the barn before being exposed. It was exactly the kind of tactical intelligence that could save lives when the next Allied push came through. But getting that information to the American forces presented a significant challenge. Marie knew that small Allied patrols occasionally moved through the area at night, probing the German positions. She had seen evidence of their passage in disturbed snow and occasional distant sounds. If she could make contact with one of these patrols, she could provide intelligence that would be invaluable. On the night of the 18th, she made her move. She had prepared carefully, packing the intelligence documents into a waterproof pouch made from an old oilcloth. She wore dark clothing and moved with the confidence of someone who knew every centimeter of this terrain. She understood where the frozen ground would crunch underfoot and where the snow had drifted deep enough to muffle sound. The journey to the stone marker at the edge of the property, a location she knew from local knowledge was used by resistance contacts, should have taken 20 minutes. Marie made it in 45, moving with agonizing slowness, pausing frequently to listen and observe. She left the intelligence package in the agreed location, a hollow beneath the marker that had been used for such purposes since the early days of occupation. Returning was even more challenging. The sky was beginning to lighten, and she needed to be back in the cellar before full dawn. More critically, she needed to make another subtle adjustment to the attic Scarecrow to maintain the illusion for one more day. She made it back with perhaps 30 minutes to spare. Moving through the dark house, she climbed to the attic and adjusted her creation one final time. She shifted the position slightly, changed the angle of the head, moved one arm. Then she did something that would prove either brilliantly clever or catastrophically foolish. She decided this would be the last day of the deception. The Scarecrow would disappear tonight, presumably because the observation mission was complete and the American had moved on. It was a natural conclusion to the performance, and it would prevent Weber from eventually discovering the truth. The third day, December 19th, began much like the previous two. Weber spotted the figure in the window, noted the subtle changes in position, and settled in for another day of patient observation. But his frustration was building. 3 days of watching this opponent, and he still hadn't taken the shot. It went against his training, his instincts, his entire philosophy of engagement. At 0920 hours, Hoffmann approached Weber's position. The Feldwebel had been reviewing their tactical situation and had made a decision. They had been in this position too long. American forces were consolidating in the region, and their small unit was at risk of being cut off completely. They would withdraw tonight under cover of darkness, moving northeast to rejoin their main defensive line. Before they left, Hoffmann said quietly, Weber should resolve the situation in the farmhouse. They couldn't leave an American observation post operational in their former sector. Take the shot this afternoon, Hoffmann ordered. Whatever Weber's reservations, it was time to eliminate the threat. Weber nodded slowly. He understood the logic, even if some part of him resisted. He had invested 3 days into this opponent, had developed a peculiar professional respect for whoever could maintain such discipline. But orders were orders, and Hoffmann was right. They couldn't leave an active enemy position behind them. He spent the next 6 hours preparing for the perfect shot. He calculated and recalculated the range, the wind, the light conditions. He dry-fired the rifle repeatedly, ensuring his muscle memory was flawless. He regulated his breathing, his heart rate, his entire physiology. This shot would be at the absolute limit of his capabilities, not because of the distance, but because of the psychological weight he had given it. At 1500 hours, with the winter sun providing optimal light, Weber made his final preparations. The figure in the window was in its usual position, binoculars raised, hat tilted, pipe visible in profile. It was the shot he had been visualizing for 3 days. His finger moved to the trigger. He controlled his breathing. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. He fired. The shot was perfect. Weber knew it the instant the rifle discharged. The trajectory, the timing, everything was exactly as he had calculated. Through his scope, he saw the impact. The figure jerked backward, the hat flying off, the binoculars dropping. Then it collapsed out of sight below the window frame. Weber felt the familiar emptiness that came after a successful engagement. 3 days of anticipation, and it was over in a fraction of a second. He reported the result to Hoffmann, who nodded with satisfaction. One less threat to worry about during their withdrawal. That night, the German unit evacuated their positions as planned. They moved northeast through the darkness, leaving behind the barn, the defensive positions, and the farmhouse with its silent attic window. Weber looked back once as they moved out, seeing the dark shape of the building against the night sky. He wondered briefly about the American he had defeated, whether the soldier had family back home, whether he had known the shot was coming in those final seconds. Marie waited in the cellar until 2 hours after full dark, giving the German soldiers time to clear the area completely. Then she emerged into the cold night air. She climbed to the attic one final time to examine her creation. Weber's shot had struck exactly where a human head would have been. The burlap sack was torn open, straw scattered across the attic floor. The hat had indeed flown off, just as she had hoped it would when she loosely positioned it. The whole scene looked exactly like what Weber would have expected to see. She carefully disassembled the Scarecrow, burning the distinctive clothing items and scattering the straw. There would be no evidence for anyone who came later to find. Then she returned to the cellar to wait for the American forces she knew would be advancing through this sector within days. 3 days later, December 22nd, American forces from the 79th Infantry Division advanced through the region. They encountered minimal resistance. The German defensive positions had been abandoned. Among the intelligence that guided their advance was a detailed map of German positions delivered by French resistance contacts, intelligence that had originated from a package found beneath a stone marker. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, the intelligence officer who received the reports, was impressed by the accuracy and detail. The intelligence had noted every defensive position, every approach route, every tactical vulnerability. It had allowed American forces to advance through the sector with minimal casualties, avoiding prepared positions and exploiting weaknesses. When Morrison's unit reached the farmhouse, they found Marie Ducroix waiting in the cellar. She was weak from days of minimal food and water, but she was alive. Through an interpreter, she explained how she had remained behind when her family evacuated, how she had observed the German positions, how she had delivered the intelligence to the resistance drop point. The interpreter hesitated before translating the next part of her story. Marie described the Scarecrow in the attic window, how she had used it to distract the German observer while she gathered intelligence. Morrison listened with growing astonishment. He requested permission to examine the attic, where he found evidence of the deception: scattered straw, a scrap of burlap with a bullet hole, marks on the floor where something had been positioned at the window for an extended period. Morrison filed a report commending Marie for her contribution to the Allied advance. The report noted that her intelligence had directly contributed to the successful movement of American forces through a contested sector with minimal casualties. It recommended her for recognition by both American and French authorities. The report didn't mention the Scarecrow specifically. Morrison thought the detail was perhaps too unusual for official documentation, but he told the story to other officers over the following weeks, and it spread through the division. The tale of the French farm girl who had used a scarecrow to fool a German sniper became one of those unofficial stories that soldiers shared, embellished, and remembered. What made the story particularly resonate was the psychology of the deception. It wasn't about superior equipment or training. It was about understanding your opponent, knowing what they expected to see, and using that expectation against them. Marie had applied lessons learned from protecting crops to protecting intelligence gathering. She had taken the patience her father taught her for dealing with crows and applied it to a far more dangerous adversary. Ernst Weber never learned the truth. After rejoining his unit, he continued serving until the end of the conflict. He survived and returned to Bavaria, where he lived for another 37 years. In his later years, he occasionally mentioned the American observer in the farmhouse attic, the opponent who had shown such extraordinary discipline. He spoke of it as one of his most challenging engagements, a worthy adversary who had pushed him to the limits of his patience and skill. Marie returned to the family farm after the conflict ended. She helped her parents rebuild what had been damaged, replanted the fields, and gradually restored the property to productivity. She never spoke much about her 3 days hiding in the cellar, preferring to focus on the future rather than the past. But her father noticed that she took special care when building scarecrows, positioning them with particular attention to angles and lighting, adjusting them frequently to maintain their effectiveness. In 1949, Marie received a commendation from the French government for her contribution to resistance efforts during the conflict. The ceremony was small, held in the local town hall, attended by family and a few veterans who understood what her intelligence had meant for the Allied advance. She accepted the recognition with quiet grace, the same way she approached everything in life. Years later, when historians began documenting the stories of French civilians who had contributed to the Allied effort, Marie's account was recorded in detail. The interviewer, a young American researcher, was fascinated by the scarecrow deception. He asked her if she had been afraid during those 3 days, knowing that a skilled marksman was watching her creation, that one wrong detail might have revealed the truth. Marie considered the question carefully before answering. She said she had been terrified, but not primarily of being discovered. Her greatest fear was that the scarecrow wouldn't be convincing enough, that Weber would see through the deception before she could complete her intelligence gathering. The fear drove her to make the creation as perfect as possible, to attend to every detail her father had taught her about making something appear real. The researcher asked what she thought was the critical element that made the deception work. Again, Marie paused to consider. She explained that it wasn't any single detail, but rather the complete picture. Weber had been looking for an American observer, so that's what he saw. The binoculars, the patient stance, the subtle position changes, each element reinforced his expectation. He wasn't fooled by the Scarecrow itself, she emphasized. He was fooled by his own assumptions about what he should be seeing. This insight revealed something profound about perception and expectation in conflict. Military training taught soldiers to recognize threats, to spot enemies, to identify dangers. But that same training could become a vulnerability when an opponent understood and exploited it. Weber had used his expertise and experience to analyze what he saw, but those very qualities had made him more susceptible to a deception that played into his professional expectations. The farmhouse still stands today, though it has been renovated and modernized over the decades. The attic remains largely unchanged, and occasionally visitors interested in history make the journey to see where an unusual chapter of the conflict unfolded. They stand at the window where the Scarecrow once watched, looking out across the fields toward where the German positions had been, trying to imagine those 3 days in December 1944. What they're really trying to understand is how an ordinary farm girl, using skills taught to her for protecting crops, managed to turn the tables on a trained military observer. They want to comprehend how patience, local knowledge, and creative thinking could overcome professional military expertise. They're seeking to grasp the deeper truth that Marie's story illustrates, that in conflict, as in life, the most powerful advantages aren't always the obvious ones. Marie Ducroix passed away in 2003 at the age of 81. She had lived to see her grandchildren grow up on the same farm where she had been raised, where she had learned to build scarecrows that could fool even the cleverest crows. Her obituary in the local newspaper mentioned her wartime service, but only briefly. To those who knew her, she was simply Marie, a farmer, a mother, a grandmother who had lived a full and productive life. But among military historians and those who study the psychology of conflict, her story remains significant. It's taught in some intelligence training programs as an example of innovative tactical deception. It's discussed in studies of asymmetric warfare as an illustration of how local knowledge can provide advantages that training and equipment cannot match. Most importantly, it's remembered as a reminder that war is ultimately about human beings making decisions based on perception, expectation, and interpretation. The 3 days that Ernst Weber spent watching Marie's Scarecrow represent a unique intersection of skill, psychology, and circumstance. He was an expert observer using all his training and experience to evaluate what he saw. She was a farm girl applying lessons learned from her father about fooling crows. In that matchup, separated by 300 meters of frozen French countryside, the advantage went not to the one with the most training, but to the one who best understood the nature of deception. In the end, both Marie and Weber were products of their experiences. He had been trained to watch for specific threats and respond to recognized patterns. She had been raised to understand how perception works, how expectations shape interpretation, how to make something artificial appear real. Neither was inherently superior to the other. They were simply operating from different knowledge bases, and in this particular circumstance, hers proved more applicable. The Scarecrow that fooled a German sniper for 3 days wasn't just a collection of old clothes and straw. It was a synthesis of childhood lessons, desperate creativity, psychological insight, and courage. It was Marie's answer to an impossible situation, trapped near enemy positions in possession of vital intelligence, with no direct way to help the approaching Allied forces. She took what she had, what she knew and what she understood about human perception, and she turned it into an advantage. That's perhaps the most enduring lesson of Marie Ducroix's story. In moments of crisis, when conventional options aren't available, the ability to think creatively and apply knowledge in unexpected ways can be more valuable than any amount of standard training. The skills we learn in peaceful times for ordinary purposes may prove surprisingly applicable when circumstances change dramatically. The German soldiers left the farmhouse area on December 19th, believing they had eliminated an American observation post. American forces advanced through the sector days later, with detailed intelligence that saved lives. And a farm girl emerged from a cellar, having accomplished something that would be remembered long after more conventional military operations had been forgotten. All because she understood that the most effective deception isn't about fooling the eyes. It's about confirming what the mind already expects to see. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, Please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.